Good evening. Welcome, everyone. We're really thrilled to have with us tonight Dr. Gretchen Sorin and Derrick Adams. We are also looking forward to welcoming Cynthia Wilson-Graham. We are having some technical difficulties. Our team is on it, and she will be joining us as soon as possible for this really exciting and important discussion. We're going to be talking about the power and the pleasures, as well as the struggle for Black leisure from both historical and contemporary perspectives. So the panel discussion complements the exhibition Derrick Adams Buoyant, which was organized by the Hudson River Museum, and it is currently on view at the MFA St. Petersburg. I have to thank our exhibition's sponsors in St. Pete. Jim Sweeny has underwritten the exhibition that made it possible to bring it to the Tampa Bay area. Jim also allowed us to, with funds, to purchase Derrick's self-portrait on float, the print he did with Tandem Press, which we're thrilled to be able to include in the exhibition. We also need to thank donors Ann and Bill Edwards. We can't wait to have them back in St. Pete in November. And I want to thank Kristen Shepard, our executive director, because she really was the one who kind of sourced this exhibition and allowed us to bring it here. And thank you to Margaret Murray, our curator of public programs, for organizing tonight's event. And I see Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to introduce our panelists just to start off. Dr. Gretchen Sorin has powerfully documented the history of African-American mobility and travel, with a particular focus on the automobile and its related infrastructure. Much of her research has really addressed the Jim Crow era and the humiliation, the unpredictability, and the violence of segregation. And she draws a very clear line to present-day racism. Dr. Sorin is Distinguished Professor and Director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program of the State University of New York. She has many years of experience as a museum consultant and curator. She's curated at exhibitions at institutions including the Jewish Museum and the Smithsonian. Her publications are numerous, but the book we wanted to talk about is the one you see on the screen. And she co-directed and co-wrote a documentary with Rick Burns that broadcast to much acclaim on Tuesday evening on PBS. For those of you in the Tampa Bay area, it will be rebroadcast this Saturday on WEDU World, and you can also stream it on the PBS website. Educator, historian, and photographer Cynthia Wilson-Graham has been instrumental in securing the historical memory of Paradise Park, the segregated African-American counterpart to Silver Springs in Marion County, Florida, near Ocala. The park opened in 1949, the same year as the Groveland 4 murder and trials, and it served as an invaluable social and recreational space for African-American communities until its closure in 1969. Wilson-Graham's advocacy earned the placement of a historical marker by the Bureau of Historic Preservation at the former entrance to Paradise Park. And with Lou Vickers, she co-authored Remembering Paradise Park, Tourism and Segregation at Silver Springs. Wilson-Graham also served as the first vice president of the Marion County NAACP, and for many years has worked for the Early Childhood Education Development Programs Head Start and Early Head Start. Born in Baltimore and based in Brooklyn, Derrick Adams is a renowned multidisciplinary artist whose work critically examines the influence of popular culture on the construction of one's self-identity. With his Floater series depicting Black figures on pool floats and scenes of repose, he works to normalize images that present a fuller picture of the Black experience, filling in critical omissions of visual culture. In doing so, the images take on a radical presence, as in the words of the co-curator James E. Bartlett, relaxation and play can be revolutionary acts when performed by those traditionally excluded from activities of leisure. Adams' work has been featured in solo exhibitions at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, Museum of Contemporary Art Denver, and more recently, the gallery at Baltimore City Hall. He's a recipient of numerous grants and awards, including a Gordon Parks Foundation Fellowship, and his artworks are in the permanent collections of institutions, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Whitney, as well as a studio museum in New York. He's currently creating a Baltimore-based artist residency program called The Last Resort. Now, tonight we're going to be hearing from these truly distinguished panelists about their critically important work, which really does take multiple perspectives on this idea of Black leisure. And before we get into discussion, we've asked our panelists to give us some overview presentations of their research and work. We will, of course, be taking questions from the audience. We ask that you enter them into the Q&A section, and we'll try to devote the last third of this program to those questions. So thank you to everyone who is joining us tonight. We can't wait to see you back at the museum. And again, it's such a pleasure to have this panel. So thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gretchen Sorin.
Thank you, Catherine. And you'll put up my slides?
Yes.
Well, in any discussion about African-American leisure, you really have to go back to the beginning. And if you go back to the beginning, you're really talking about, may I have the next slide, please? Enslaved people. And the reason I like to start, I feel it's important to start with enslaved people, is because what we're talking about for African Americans is mobility. That's my big idea, is mobility. How has mobility been denied to African Americans when it was one of the most important tenets of freedom? And so here we have a slave pass. Now, African Americans, to move about in any way during the period of slavery, African Americans had a pass. You either had to have a paper pass or you had to have a metal tag that was affixed to your body at all times. You could not leave. Many slaves never left more than a 1 mile radius of their plantation during their entire lives. So mobility becomes an incredibly important thing and really the hallmark of freedom. Now, if you were traveling throughout the United States on public transportation, it was segregated north and south, east and west. And here you see a colored waiting room. Now, for African Americans, traveling on public transportation was not only dangerous and humiliating, but it was filthy. And you can imagine how demeaning it was for African American children as well as their parents. So when people could get cars, they get cars. May I have the next slide, please? So African Americans start to become consumers in the 1940s and 50s. They become consumers of travel, just as they were consumers of coffee percolators and Frigidaires and toaster ovens, and they become consumers of travel. Next slide, please. Now, the automobile is what takes African Americans throughout the country. It takes African Americans on vacation, and after the Great Migration, which begins in the early 20th century, it takes African Americans from the cities of the North back home to the South to visit relatives. But make no mistake about it, the automobile was also a status symbol. And here you can see on a Harlem street this absolutely marvelous Cadillac. Next slide, please. But think about the environment that African Americans faced when they went on the road, when they traveled for vacations, when they traveled for business. Typically, you would see signs like this, which is "Welcome to Klan Country." Next sign, please. And here, this is the sign over the main street of Greenville, Texas. Greenville, welcome, the blackest land, the whitest people. Next slide, please. There were also hundreds and hundreds of sundown towns in the United States. Now, a sundown town is a town that you had to be out of if you were Black. You had to be out of that town by sundown. And many of the towns had signs like this that told you you needed to be out of town. There were even a couple of towns that had a siren that went off at 6 o'clock, telling Black people, you better be out of the town now. Next slide, please. But Victor Green, who was a New York City businessman, created a guidebook. It was called the Negro Motorist Guide. And some of you may have seen the Oscar-winning movie, The Green Book. Victor Green used a slogan that was actually said by Mark Twain: travel is fatal to prejudice. And Green really believed that if, as African Americans traveled, that white Americans would meet them and see that there was no difference. That was Green's dream, that with his travel guide, African Americans would travel the country and help to defeat prejudice. Next slide, please. So the Negro Motorist Green Book, which was one of many guides that were produced in the United States, was produced between 1936 and 1966 from the Green Book offices on Lenox Avenue in Manhattan. And it included hotels and motels, garages where you could get your car fixed, nightclubs, service stations, hairdressers, even drugstores. Next slide, please. The automobile becomes essential for African Americans. Not only does it give them freedom, freedom from the Jim Crow bus, freedom from the Jim Crow train, but it also becomes a weapon in the arsenal of civil rights. And this is the Jenkins microbus. It's now at the Smithsonian. And this was a bus that was used to drive all over South Carolina to register voters. Now, if you think about it, you can't register voters. You can't bring healthcare to people. You can't bring education out to the community without a car. And this was one of the cars that was used to do that. Next slide, please. Also, if you think about the Montgomery bus boycott, and there were also boycotts in Florida that used the same technique. Martin Luther King and the team that worked on the bus boycott purchased a fleet of cars, and they used those cars to boycott the segregated buses. And they were able to reduce the ridership on the buses by 69% and basically bankrupt the buses. So the automobile is really a tool that African Americans used to defeat segregation. Next slide, please. But I want to bring you up quickly to the present. And I would like you to think about the relationship between African Americans and law enforcement, because this is our current issue with the automobile. Although the automobile gave African Americans incredible freedom of movement, it took away the humiliation of the Jim Crow transportation system, but there were also dangers along the road. And one of those dangers was the fact that African Americans were racially profiled by the police. There were lawsuits in both Maryland and New Jersey saying that the state troopers had wrongfully profiled African Americans, and both of those states were found guilty of racial profiling. This is still going on in the United States to this day. This is Philando Castile, who was murdered by the police while he was sitting in his car. Next slide, please. And of course, you are all familiar with George Floyd, who was sitting in his car and was pulled out of his car by the police and was murdered. So I end with this cartoon, which is, I hesitate to call it a cartoon because it's not funny. It's a drawing by a cartoonist for a Midwestern newspaper. And I think it's useful in thinking about what it means to be an African-American driver or a passenger in a car, even to this day. African-Americans tell their children, you have to be courteous. You have to obey lawful orders. You have to have your license and registration ready. But the message of this cartoon is, even if you do all of those things, it won't necessarily protect you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Gretchen. And we have Cynthia Wilson-Graham. Cynthia, if you could start your video, and I will start your PowerPoint.
I think I did. Are we ready? Good afternoon. This is Eddie Vereen, the park manager of Paradise Park, which was a segregated section of Silver Springs that was just about 3 miles up the river from the head of the springs. You might have heard about Paradise Park, Silver Springs and the glass bottom boats and the clear waters at Silver Springs, but often you didn't hear anything about the sister park, Paradise Park. Just a couple of miles up the river. They used the same Silver River, up and down the river. They used the same boats, and they shared different grounds and different interests. And Eddie Vereen was a boat captain at Silver Springs during that time, but he was offered the position to run Paradise Park. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So if you focus on this particular brochure here, this is before Paradise Park era. The park was opened up as a white park that focused on white guests that had white boatmen, meaning that all of the drivers at this new Paradise was going to be white, and it was a park that was in competition to Silver Springs. So before there was even a Paradise Park at Silver Spring, this park existed in the same exact location, and M.R. Porter opened it up in 1929 as a competition park to Silver Springs. And if you look at the left, it shows you the diagram of the springs and the body of water to show how close in proximity Silver Springs was from Paradise Park. Next slide, please. And this is Paradise Park. This is a park that was opened up in 1949, and this was off the beaten path. So as Dr. Gretchen has said, they needed somewhere to go. They needed somewhere to have leisure opportunities to go. And Paradise Park was the one location that was not compared to a lot of places because it was just the river from Silver Springs, and it was owned by white people. The same persons that own Paradise Park also own Silver Springs, and that was Ray and Davison. So Ray and Davison seen an opportunity to put Mr. Porter out of business, so they partnered and bought the land that the other park was in, and then called it for colored people only for their park. Next slide. This is the historical marker that's at the entrance where Paradise Park was. There were 2 entrances to the park. Again, we're talking about 2 parks, separate entrances on the same body of water. It's just like that imaginary line that divided the waters. They would pass on the glass bottom boats going up and down the river, but they never came into contact with each other. However, the majority of people who worked at Silver Springs were minorities, but they could not go to Silver Springs and have their families there with them. They had to go to Paradise Park, but before Paradise Park ever opened, they had nowhere to take their families other than a regular beach or off the beaten path. And we have to talk about, this is a time that was during that Jim Crow's era, where it was just not safe for African Americans to go anywhere without being getting themselves into trouble for no reason at all. This was during that segregated time, Jim Crow's era, but they still found the luxury to make sure that they had fun with their families and they were able to have leisure time. Next slide, please. The reason why I do what I do is to make sure that the history is preserved for Paradise Park and other places throughout the country, really. We have laid the foundation for many of these places that are now high-end places that we cannot even get into, because we do know that segregation still existed but has a different name to it right now. And that's Larissa Lake in this picture right here. She still lives in Ocala. She's holding a picture of herself. She was the person that modeled for that picture that is advertised on all of Paradise Park's advertisement. And in speaking with her and speaking with her family, we gave her more life to live just by recognizing the work that she did. And all she said she did was posed on a tree for a picture. But that picture went throughout the country. That one picture, and most information that you will find, you're gonna find her on the cover art of that picture. And documenting our history, preserving our history is critical. And oftentimes we don't preserve our history because we don't know it. I didn't know anything about Paradise Park before I started my research. Early on, took about 10 years or more before the book was ever produced. But I found out that all of the history I needed was right in my own community, right around the area where I lived and where I raised and where I attended school. And it's just trying to find those individuals that have the history, that have the information, because the information is not in the books, it's not at the libraries, it's not at the museums. So it's very critical that we work with all of our families to make sure that they know that their history is just as important to us. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cynthia. It was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Derrick Adams. I'm going to start with this very inspirational photograph. A while ago, maybe 5 years ago, in my studio, I started to think about subject matter, which most artists think about when they're about to start a new body of work. And usually when I start a new body of work, I start to think about images that I feel are not presented as much as other images that I feel are covered by my peers and other artists who are interested in similar narratives relating to the Black body and the history of Black culture. And I I always go to Google search first, and I look at images that I think about, figures I think about, and see if I can find images that are reflective of ideas I have. And so I Googled MLK, and I started looking at images on Google, and the images that I saw of MLK as well as Malcolm X were all images dealing with unrest and fighting against civil rights, fighting for civil rights. And then I started to keep scroll down deeper and deeper into the Google search, and I came across this particular image of MLK, and it's a spread from Ebony magazine in 1967 of him sitting in a pool with his wife Coretta, and they're enjoying a vacation in Jamaica. And I read the article, and it talks, and Martin talks about how he felt being on this vacation and how he really enjoyed this time. And I started to really think about all of the pioneers in the civil rights movement and before who dealt with all of these injustices and dealt with this, knowing their worth, knowing their ability, knowing what they deserve, dealing with the oppressive structures around them, and how taking a break, a vacation, that alone was an act of resistance and rebellion, because I felt that's even taught within my community growing up with my grandfather in Baltimore, is that we couldn't even look like we were relaxing. Like when he came home from work, we had to pretend that we were doing stuff. And I think that was part of the culture that I was familiar with, where it was imposed on him that as a Black person or as a working class person, you had to be accountable for your existence by working. And when I saw this image, I realized the complexity of this image of MLK relaxing, and how that became a central part of what I decided to make in my work with the Floater series. Next slide. And I became really interested in the idea of leisure. At first, I thought about it as this thing of what I wanted to see in the world. I realized that as a Black person, it was very common for me to walk into a museum or a gallery and see images of Black people being subject to other races of injustice when things are being done to us, and or us pushing against things. This is very common in contemporary art, which I think is necessary. That's a narrative that I feel is very informative, and it also mirrors what is happening in the world. But what I realized was not happening in the world is seeing images of us relaxing, us not necessarily performing for others, but performing for each other. And so that became a very important part of the movement in which I started to make work in this particular series. And then it extended into the Green Book, which became the subject of my exhibition at Museum of Art and Design. And what really fascinated me about the Green Book as the image of MLK in Jamaica in Jet Magazine is that, next slide, that regardless of all the injustices that Black people have faced and are facing, we still find time to gather, and we still find time to enjoy our family time and to think about those things as being nourishment for us. And churches play a major part of our social engagement, but also clubs and different things that we, for me, I feel like it's even more important, so-called, than the way the other races may think about leisure. Because for me, leisure has always been something that has been looked at as for people who have the free time to do this. And for Black culture, for me, even regardless of the economic levels of the Black people in my family and the Black people I've come in contact with, the idea of relaxation to me has always been political. The fact that you don't have to do anything in order to be doing something. Like, to me, I think a lot of things that I've been able to experience as an artist has been based on my ability to have reflective moments. And I also felt like being in that moment of relaxation has helped me to compartmentalize things that I feel have been really helpful for me as a human. So when I was asked, and when I was invited to do a show at Museum of Art and Design, I really thought about the Green Book, not only as this vehicle to take Black people to safety, but I thought more of a celebration of the author and the creator of the Green Book, Victor Hugo Green. He and his wife, him being a postal worker on his own time, took it upon himself to create this publication that I felt related to the ideas behind the Museum of Art and Design, because I felt like it was a beautifully designed publication for its time. And I thought that it had a certain level of high quality and thought that deserved to be in a space that is dedicated to design. I also thought that Victor Hugo Green, being a postal worker on his own time, compiled his information with his network, deserved to have an exhibition that really exalted who he was as a creative person to think of these things. Knowing all of the tragedy involved in the plight of the Black American in travel, something that as a Black person, I'm constantly reminded when I step out of my house. I also wanted to acknowledge the efforts and the achievements through Mr. Green by putting this publication together, and talk about the joyous experiences that Black people also had when they were reunited with family down south, and all of the coding that went with the idea of travel. In this image, there's a road, and I believe this piece is called Keep Your Head Down and Your Eyes Forward. And this piece is a road that the cars that are on the road are made of these objects we call flat caps. Some people call them driving hats. These are hats that Black Americans wore in service industry jobs, but Black Americans who were of means and can afford more expensive cars would also wear these hats to camouflage themselves as service workers when they were on the road, not to be stopped by the police or other people who were triggered by the fact that a Black person was driving a nice car. Next slide. And this goes again with my work with the floaters that at the museum now, but also travel for Hudson River Museum. And this is an image actually of my family in the pool last summer, a photographic image first, and then painted to depict the things that I feel are so necessary for the next generation to see. You know, I think about the next generation more so than this generation. And as an artist, I'm also interested in depictions of leisure as definitely as a form of resistance, but as a form of talking about the complexity of the Black experience, and that because of all the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, it's important to remind ourselves of our humanity through our moments of gathering and family time. And I honestly believe that the Black figure in its entirety is political anyway. Seeing a Black figure in any type of media brings us a whole level of trauma and politics that has just been embedded in the way that people see us. For me, I'm really interested in complicating that even more by creating situations where we can just exist in the way that I feel I exist when I'm not doing things to prove my level of competency to the world. And so this particular series, The Floaters, started in 2015, and I've enjoyed making these works because I think these are very reflective of the ambitions and the desires that the subjects that I represent aim for and experience on a daily basis. Next slide. Well, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. All right. Thank you all for those presentations. It's so good to see you here. I wanted to start with a question to you, Gretchen. You make clear in your book that it was collaborative direct action that led to desegregation in the Civil Rights Act, but you have detailed the goals of the African American travel guides, like, of course, the Green Book, and I'd also love you to talk about Alma Green as the first Black female major publisher, and William Butler's Travel Guide, and they had differences, but you suggest that they established gentle civil rights activism. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on their goals and how you think they were sort of enacted in civil rights.
You know, the Green Book never talked about segregation. The guides didn't talk about civil rights much. There was very little in them about civil rights. They were very passive in their discussion of what was actually going on in the country, of the intimidation African Americans were facing, the violence African Americans were facing. They were what I call very middle class polite. They reminded me so much of my parents' generation, this very polite, middle class activism that is behind the scenes pushing hard. Black people knew the message of the Green Book. They understood it was coded language, and they understood exactly what it meant. But they needed the Green Book and the other guides. They needed especially the Green Book to appeal to white people, because it was Exxon, well, we call it Exxon. In those days, it was Esso gas that supported the Green Book and Standard Oil. And they needed to have white allies because they circulated the Green Book at all of the Esso gas stations. And so they had to use this coded language. It's like, Black people know what we mean. White people need it to be very, very calm, middle class, appropriate language.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot now, right? If you support civil rights in an active way, you get called a socialist, right? Or you get called names, or you get tarred as a radical, a Black radical. And I, in my calm middle class way, I've been called a Black radical, and I think, really, you don't really know what a radical is if you think I'm My behavior is radical. So I think it's still happening that African Americans use this coded language. And I have to give a shout out for Alma Green.
Yes, sorry, I omitted her.
Thank you, Derrick. I was so pleased. I was so pleased that you did. Victor Green, something happens to him in the late 50s. He gets sick, maybe he has a heart attack, maybe he has a stroke. I don't know which. But he's out of the picture. And there are 5 women that are running the Green Book. Alma and 4 women. And this was unheard of in the 50s, that women in publishing. So this is a woman-owned publishing company. Amazing. Victor Green was still the face of the company, but Alma was doing all the running of it, and the writers were all women. So thank you.
Thank you for that information. You know, I'm gonna add that to my narrative.
Good, yay.
It's very important, yes.
Now, Cynthia, you, throughout your book, you have many accounts of the importance of Paradise Park as a safe social and recreational space during times of extreme violence and conflict. So what were some of the specific roles that Paradise Park played for African Americans and their families, including many activists who were doing extremely dangerous work, but as you point out, they found time for Paradise Park?
As Derrick said, family is important, and we know the church is important as well. So not only it was a recreational facility for guests, but they had baptisms. I mean, it was just a safe haven. When you went into Paradise Park, the road, Paradise Road, is still there, it still exists. So if you drove down the road maybe 2 miles, you're off the beaten path. So you don't have to worry about looking over your shoulder or anything to see who's coming, because if you came to Paradise Park, basically everyone looked like you, unless it was a tour guide or the bus company owner that was bringing in the guest. But we're talking about people being lynched, people being murdered, and we talk about Black Lives Matter right now, and Black lives do matter, but this is some of the same things that we were been talking about for years and years and years, but it is still happening today. We still are preaching the same words that have been said so many times. And I recently read this book, Heritage, Tourism, and Race, The Other Side of Leisure, and it was quite interesting to give us by Antoinette Jackson, and she gives a different take on our leisure. And as Derrick said, and Dr. Gretchen has said, that leisure part of our lives, we've always made it happen, in a lack of a better word. Regardless of where we were or what we were doing, we still enjoyed our family and our social life. Even if we couldn't enjoy it to the capacity that we wanted to, it was still some enjoyment, whether it was at the home or at a park or at a church.
And Paradise Park, in opposition to Silver Springs, had a jukebox. And that seemed to be a major space of social gatherings.
Well, yes. Well, food, music, fun plays a significant role in our lives. And when Paradise Park closed, that's why you will hear some say that we were assimilated to Silver Spring, because our culture was lost when we went to Silver Springs. It was just like we were guests in our own backyard because we were never able to go. Mm-hmm. And just recently, now we know about Paradise Park because there was no literature, there was nothing on the internet about Paradise Park until I started this research about over a decade ago. But now you can find different information about it.
We can, thanks to you. Now,
Somebody got to do it. Somebody got to do it. Somebody got to do it, you know? Somebody got to do it.
One project, yes.
I have a question for Gretchen and Derrick. So Gretchen, in one of the last chapters of your book, you really do start focusing on some of the safe spaces for civil rights activists in the South, like Dookie Chase's restaurant in New Orleans and Pascal's in Atlanta. And I was thinking that there might be a parallel here with Derrick, your series, We Came to Party and Plan, which looks at the exchanges, which very often are political, that can happen at spaces of recreation or celebration. So I was wondering, Gretchen, if you could tell us a bit more about those spaces, like how the great late Leah Chase made Dookie Chase a safe place, and if Derrick, you could tell us a bit about the We Came to Party and Plan series.
Well, Dookie Chase, just for people that don't know, is this amazing restaurant in New Orleans, and it's one of the few places that's still in operation. And Leah Chase and her husband operated this place since the 30s, and Leah Chase was 96. She just died this past summer, sadly. But we have her on tape, on film, which I think was so wonderful.
Amazing.
And Dookie Chase's sold this amazing Cajun and Creole food that is incredible. When our team went to film them, they just ate themselves silly, this food. But Dookie Chase had established these great relationships with the people in the community. And as a result, what she says is, when you got in there, nobody would bother you. And the civil rights workers would meet there to go out on civil rights marches. Black and white gathered at Dookie Chase's, and nobody would bother you. But I just want to add one thing to what Cynthia was saying, which was incredible. But based on my research, every place, there was a network of tourist houses, guest homes, restaurants, businesses, Black-owned businesses that entrepreneurs developed all over the United States. And they went out of business when civil rights legislation came, because the Black people opened up the Hotel Hilton, the Sheraton, the Holiday Inn, the Howard Johnson's, all those, when those opened up to Black people went to them because they could, because they had been denied so long. So they went to these places, and that took the business away from Black businesses, and most of those Black businesses went out of business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll come back to that thought, because I think it's very important to acknowledge the Black businesses that were lost after desegregation. I wonder if Derrick could chime in about We Came to Party and Plan and these safe.
Well, going, just kind of building off of Cynthia and Gretchen's presentation around the idea of gatherings, based on the structure that we've been forced to flourish in, Black people have always mixed pleasure with politics, because social gatherings have been, from slavery, have always been the time where we were allowed to congregate with each other. It was, one time a year when they had the slave masters would allow the slaves to have their dinner, social festival thing. And that's when other slaves would come from other plantations and join into the festivities. And it usually was a more traumatic time, because usually after that, that's when they were sold off. It was like a thing that happened at the end of the year. And some people call it one of the things that happened during New Year. New Year was not looked at as a celebratory time for most Black people in America at that time. So for us, every moment is seized as an opportunity to advance in conversation while we're socializing. And I think it kind of came from that experience. So when we're in church, that's why politicians go to their church when they want to get Black people to vote. They know that Black people will be at church, and these are the Black people who are considered pillars in their community. They go to the barbershops, they go to the restaurants where Black people congregate. They know where we meet. They know that we're interested in politics. They go to places where they know we're enjoying each other's company, and they come and they try to actually camouflage themselves into pretending that they're using hot sauce like we're doing. And they're doing the things that, they're dancing with us. They're doing things that they believe will kind of break into our tribe by kind of, somehow intermingling with us in our form of leisure, because they realize that most things that we do that are political and that are radical are done through our form of pleasure. Because pleasure for us is, we feed off of each other. The energy that we get to help us to move forward is based on our level of communication and the things that happen in spaces that are not necessarily designed as political spaces. So just the whole idea of politics, the way we look at, the Senate floor and all those things that we see, that's not how we actually communicate as Black people. I think we communicate over food. We communicate at a picnic, at a barbecue. We have barbershop. Those things that I feel, politicians, they target those places when they're trying to get our support as a community. And for me, when I made Party and Plan, I realized that one day I was at a party with my friends, and we're all hanging out, we're eating, drinking, and I looked around at the party and I realized some of my friends were physicists and politicians and, artists and, doctors. And we're talking about current events. We're talking about things that are happening. We're talking about movements. We're having all these things and we're talking and we're laughing, we're dancing, we're having a good time, but things are happening. It might appear that our guards are down or we're not thinking deeply about things, but leisure has always been a form of camouflage. When you think about Black culture, it's always been a way for us to kind of get things done, get business done, and that's the reason why I believe that people don't like to see us gather together. They don't like to see us in a huddle or forming. When we form, we're like a mob. We're called a mob when we form. We're not like a crowd or group of people. We're presented as hostile when we're gathered, because it's the presence of us gathering together is a threatening image. And for me, I of course I know differently.
And it's intimidating.
You
Yes.
see when you see young Black guys walking down the street together, it's a thing that people assume that they're up to something negative versus something positive. So we're dealing with all these different images that reflect what Black culture is to other people. But for me, as a Black person, I realize there's a lot of nuances in between what we do in our social gathering versus what happens in politics. And I think that's part of what we should not ever think less about. And so my work is really pushing this narrative of leisure and relaxation as being a very radical thing, because people don't think that we should be relaxing. Even us as Black people can sometimes look at other Black people in a leisurely position and say, what are they relaxing for? With all this going on in the world. No, doesn't mean we're not thinking,
Perceived as lazy.
Yes, and that's something that,
Yes.
I'm trying to wrap my head around as well as a person, as a Black person, because I realize a lot of things are being done in these times of leisure. And I like to see more of that in the world, because to me, I feel like if anybody needs a break, we need a break. We need to see images of us not doing stuff. I think we need to see images and repose. I think we need to see images of paradise, Paradise Park. We need to see more images of that. There's a reason why those images are not.
Come see me. Okay.
There's a reason why those images are not prominent. There's a reason why those images are not prominent of us versus the other images that we see. It's on purpose. It's not by mistake. So that's what I'm interested in, pushing that narrative out in the world to become more of the dominant narrative with everything we are facing in society.
Thank you, Derrick. And I think the Floaters series is an incredible way of doing that. And I do love to go back always to you saying that you do this for the next generation, not necessarily contemporaries or peers.
Yeah.
Now, we have lots of questions from our audience. And before we go there, I do want to spend some time just thinking about these lost histories. And Cynthia, the last quotes in your book are just so gut-wrenching about the lack of history of Paradise Park. There's one quote from Dorsey Miller regarding its closure after desegregation. Silver Springs was not ours, and then they had taken what I felt was ours away from us, Paradise Park. It was not integration that occurred for us. They obliterated our site, wiped out our history and culture. So your work, Cynthia, has obviously ensured that it will not be forgotten. It will be shared with future generations. But I guess you have already, but even spend a bit more time on the importance and journey of preserving this history, and also maybe detailing, this total failure of having closed it in the first place.
Well, the beautiful grounds of Paradise Park still exist. No one can visit the grounds of Paradise Park. Paradise Road is still there. Like I said, it's about 3 miles up the river from the head of the springs. And if you go to Silver Spring State Park right now, you may find one African-American worker there at the park now. So most of them have aged out. Roosevelt Faison, I think he worked there 58 years. And then his brother about 55 years. And then Virginia Ferguson, 30 plus years. And all of these individuals are gone. So the history reside with them now. When I was writing a book on Paradise Park, when one of the filmers were completing his film series, Mark Emery completed his film series, he also interviewed these same boat captains. So the stories lie with those captains if we don't capture their memories now. They're all retired, is one left, and he's getting older. But the history of Paradise Park and what Dorsey Miller said, Dr. Dorsey Miller, his son is an attorney, so he's a, well-to-do person. But when I interviewed him, he just told it exactly like it was, some things you could not write. But we were assimilated. They completely closed it down. If there was anything that they wanted to do for Paradise Park, a section could have stayed open to be integrated, like Ross Allen and the other places that participated at that time period. Paradise Park was wrote into this plan, but there's no funding for the section of Paradise Park. So it's critical that I keep pushing and we keep pushing towards those entities that will make sure that our history is preserved and is not going on the beaten path and nobody know about it anymore. And no one cares. And the older individuals in our community, we have to make them understand it's not that we're trying to make them relive the past, because the past is very painful for some individuals, whereas some individuals like Larissa Lake were more than willing to share her story. But as Derrick said, we fought wars over the color of our skin and gathering. That was one thing they did not want us to do, is gather. No matter how we prepared ourselves, no matter the little that we did have, we made sure that we had fun when we did get together. But it's little to nothing there now at Paradise Park, and you can't visit the site. But history is history, and we must preserve it.
Yes.
Thank you, Cynthia. Gretchen, you do, of course, in Driving While Black, talk about the, again, the lack of integration after segregation, the fact that there was a detrimental effect on Black businesses. The problem was that these Black enterprises did not gain any white customers. Are there specific Black businesses that you would like to draw attention to that didn't make it? And do you think there is hope or any changes in terms of broader support for Black businesses now?
Oh, well, there's another reason that Black businesses didn't make it, besides the integration of hotels and motels and public accommodations, and that is urban renewal. So in the 1960s, we have downtowns and historically Black neighborhoods being destroyed because it was the path of least resistance for legislators, for politicians. So they put roads and highways. That's kind of the irony of this whole, roads and highways are, for African Americans, are important because they prevent African Americans from having to drive through small towns. You can stay on the highway. It was perceived as being safer to stay on the highway than to have to drive through all these little downtown areas. but at the same time, where do the highways go? The highways go right through Black communities. Even my grandmother's house, my grandmother had a house in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and her house was taken by eminent domain, and they put a highway right through her house. So a lot of the, somebody in the chat asked if I had visited a lot of the Green Book sites. Well, I went looking. The state capital of New York is Albany, and I went to Albany. There are lots of Green Book sites listed in Albany, New York, and I went looking for them. And there was a street that I didn't know where it was. I had never heard of it, and I know a lot about Albany. I go to Albany quite often, but I'd never heard of this street. So I'm driving around the Black neighborhood looking for the street, and I realized that the entire street is under the Empire State Plaza. So the street doesn't even exist anymore. That when Governor Rockefeller put in his great Albany Empire State Plaza, which is to house this incredible art collection underground, he bulldozed the Black neighborhood, and there are entire streets that no longer exist. So, I think that's emblematic of what happens all over the country. Only about 3% of the sites that are in the Green Book still exist in any form whatsoever, either standing or abandoned, only about 3%. But what I can say, the hopeful thing is that this year, after the murder of George Floyd, white allies and accomplices have been saying, I want to patronize Black businesses. So we're starting to see people say, don't buy your books from Amazon. And I tell people, don't buy my book from Amazon. Go to bookshop.org and buy the book. And then that money goes to an independent book dealer, and bookshop.org supports Black independent book dealers. Or go to your local independent book dealer. When I do talks, I say, let's find a local book dealer in the Black neighborhood and support that book dealer. But people are starting to buy products that are made by African Americans and to support African American products. So I think that's great.
And this was one of the questions that I saw in Q&A. I'm starting to dig into some of the questions. And there was one question about how many sites from the Green Book are left. But more than that, have any of you visited any of those sites that are still around?
I had the privilege of visiting a couple of sites. One in Orlando, I think it was Dr. Pierce, had a hotel that is now a nonprofit where there's memorabilia from the hotel that he created. He was a doctor, and the history is that he delivered most of the children in that town at the time, and that he used his own money to build this space, this hotel, and very interesting history, because he also built next door to that to the hotel, he built a social space for like weddings and club gatherings that was next door, that's no longer there. And he also, a very important attorney, stayed there. Well, luckily the log was there, so all the people, Thurgood Marshall stayed there when he had to try a case, and he couldn't stay in a neighboring county outside of a very famous case where he had to drive, I think they said 50 miles to try the case, because he was told that the Black people in the next county were threatened for him not to stay at their house. So he had to drive to Orlando to stay in this hotel, just for the safety of the host in this other county where he was trying this case. I don't know all the details, but I remember usually when I travel, I'll post it on social media, and a lot of historians from different cities will tell me, when you come to my city, I'm going to show you a Green Book site. And that's how I ended up finding out about this place. And in the log, the hotel log, it had everyone from Ray Charles and all the celebrities who stayed there, who visited that city, politicians, lawyers, doctors. Their handwriting was in this book that was part of the tour of the hotel, and they also had some of the rooms that were still resurrected to period furniture placed in the rooms upstairs that they now allow other nonprofits to use them as offices. What I thought was really interesting is that his house was where the new stadium is built. And so, as an exchange, they actually lifted up his house and brought it next to the hotel. And now they're reconstructing his house next to the site where the hotel was. So I got to find the info. It's in Orlando. I'm not sure exactly, but I believe his name was Pierce, Dr. Pierce. And then I found another place in Miami, similar. Like when I go out of town, I usually go to sites where I'm invited for tours from different African American historical societies. I mean, I personally feel like, to me, that's the biggest challenge I've learned in my travels as an artist, that the lack of Black American historical societies in cities. I think that's something that I would love to start a fund for, because I feel like that's one thing that I feel is lacking in our history, is having a place, even if it's a house in a city, where Black people and other people are interested in the history of that city, are able to come and understand the content of the Green Book in a different way. I found that, to me, is the more challenging part, is finding historical society, African American historical society in many cities I've traveled. And I would love to see that change. I really would.
Thank you. We have a question for Dr. Sorin. She referenced, I just lost it.
I think I just answered. I apologize. I think I just typed the answer, and so it zapped it away. I'm sorry.
Nope, that's great.
What was it?
It was, when were the lawsuits for racial profiling? And they were in the 1990s, so they were recent. And the lawsuits were done by a man at Temple University named John Lambreth. And he was involved in suits related to Maryland and New Jersey, and both were found guilty of racially profiling African Americans on the New Jersey Turnpike and also some road in Maryland. And they had to, the deal was that they had actually stopped a motorist in Maryland, and they had gotten a Black family out and had them stand in the rain while they brought drug sniffing dogs. And the family was on their way to a funeral. They made the mistake of stopping a Harvard-trained lawyer, and he cleaned their clock. And he made sure that part of the settlement in Maryland was that they were required to track every single traffic stop and write down whether the person they stopped was Black or white or Asian or Latino, so that they could actually track whether or not Maryland was continuing to racially profile. So both New Jersey and Maryland were under court orders not to racially profile. But it wasn't until the 1990s, so that tells you something.
Yeah.
We also have a comment, Derrick. Anonymous says, "Thanks for explaining my grandfather to me. When we were growing up and visited him in Louisiana as children, we always needed to be looking like we were doing something. He worked all the time except for going to church and expected us to do the same when we were there. However, leisure is important."
Yeah, I remember those times. Get to pick up a broom, pretend you're doing stuff.
I hear you. Thank you. I'm back on. I can hear you.
Oh, good.
Yay.
Oh boy, Cynthia. Let's see.
Do you all know about the Hampton House in Miami?
Someone would bring that up.
Miami?
Miami. It's in Miami.
Yeah, is that the boarding house?
No, it was a luxury hotel.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, that's when I went to Miami and they took me on a tour. Now it's like I guess it's renovated into something else.
Yeah.
But it was a historical place, and I went by. But it's also, I forgot the individual who opened it, but he also opened, his house is being renovated now again for people visitors, and across the street was a boarding house for Black and Native American travelers. That's now an art space in Overtown, and
Yes.
yeah, and it's amazing. His house was amazing. Right now they're working on it. They're going to open it up at some point as a historical landmark, and that the other space you were talking about has been converted into like a luxury condo or something. But they preserved his house and a couple of other properties in the area that he started.
I think
But that's what's in,
is different.
yeah.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Yeah, in Ocala, most of the places are being torn down that was historically Black businesses because they're not being renovated or saved. Those buildings are literally being torn down. So if you go to East Ocala, you can see renovations and restoration. But when you come into the west section of town, you don't see that same thing.
We have a more process sort of question for Derrick from Neil. Can you talk about color in your work, which seems to have subtleties but overtly reflects the excess sugary quality of Florida tourist merchandise in Florida?
Because of the sugar plantations.
I think of those colors as a warped fiction of the actuality of Florida. We know these aren't necessarily in Florida, but can you talk about the relationship of pleasure and fiction in the act of making or painting in relationship to the content of the work?
Well, for me, color plays a really major part in the depiction of representation of the black body, and how color, for me, is only used in the way to communicate more about aspirational qualities that I feel are tied to the way that Black figures, if outside of art, feel that they want to be represented. I grew up in a very particular type of family structure where, I grew up in church, going to church. I was in the choir, a lot of different things. I mean, I remember growing up where my aunts would drive around to like 20 different places to make sure the stockings matched their dress. And it had to be the same shade of blue as their whatever. Everyone, our family would get on the phone and everyone would be calling from different malls and stuff saying, I found those tights you were looking for. I found that blouse is the blue that you said. So color to me has always been very symbolic to representation. I'm really conscious of the way that I construct images through color to reflect things that has to do with mood and emotion. That's really a deliberate, the way I think about color. I think about art as a form of not only reality, but stressing the fantasy of what is possible through color and the representation of the Black figure in color, and how it plays a major part in the way that, culturally, how we look at color and how color is a reflection of everything, that we do. Everything that we feel is based on some form of color representation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, with who we are. So color is always deliberate, but also as an artist, I also look at works from Jacob Lawrence and Romeo Bearden and Elizabeth Catlett and contemporary artists for color palette based on when I made the show at Museum of Art and Design, I would look at the Migration series by Jacob Lawrence. So if you look at the Migration palette, you will see that I use the same exact palette to make the show at Museum of Art and Design. The same colors that are in the art in that body of work are reflected in the series of the Migration. The same tones of orange and blues and greens are implemented in this body of work as a very conscious effort to have a conversation with Jacob Lawrence's work and with my work. So I'm always thinking about, you know, there's really, to me, I feel like it's really important as for an artist to use like my platform to create a dialogue with artists of the past that I feel have, you know, they held so much weight talking about culture and talking about us and talking about our plight. And as a young artist, I want to continue the conversation with my work, but also to acknowledge their contribution as creative people within my practice. So anytime I have a chance to actually implement those things in my work, I make a conscious effort to put that out in the work, even if it's embedded in the work in a very coded manner. Because yes, I come from that middle-class Black history where you figure out how to get things done. You know, the people who are treasured the most are the people who don't want to take credit for doing things. Where I come from, the people who are acknowledged the most are the people who want to be behind the scenes, but are doing a lot of things that people don't realize they're doing, and they don't want to have credit for it. And so I grew up in that type of environment when it's really, as long as the material is doing what it's supposed to do, that's what the success of it. If you're giving money to someone and you see them succeed, then you've done your job. That's right. And seeing that person succeed is all the recognition you need. They don't have to know where it came from. They have to know that you have to know that you were able to be a part of something great and to help someone succeed. So when I'm thinking about color and thinking about implementing color and implementing ideas in my art, I'm always thinking about how to push the narrative along through my my ability to create visual imagery. And if people respond to it in a way that I feel that make them feel empowered, I feel like I've done my job as an artist.
That makes me think about the Florida Highwaymen.
Yes, exactly.
So it makes me think about them when you're talking about your creative spaces and what you're thinking about, but you know, they just drove up and down literally and sold art out of their car.
Yep.
They painted by the roadside and sold the art as a way of living.
Yep.
But their art has expanded.
Yeah.
It's hard to even purchase a portrait.
You can.
Right now.
Really?
But we still have several of them living right here in Florida. Sure, you would love to meet them.
I want one of their paintings. I want to talk to them. I know exactly who they are. I would love to have one of their paintings.
Yes. And Dr. Gretchen, the other thing about you, I always wondered why my father, who's a petite man, had to drive a Cadillac. But after I read the book, he was talking about the big cars because they slept in them. They didn't have anywhere to, they didn't have hotels to put them in, so they bought a big car. Yep. So that became their sleeping quarters as well.
Yes.
That brought it to light.
And I call it your rolling living room. It was, you did everything in your car. So you wanted it to be comfortable. You wanted it to be, you know, those big bank seats. No, there were no bucket seats. And that was like a big sofa.
Yes. It helped me understand that piece of history. I never understood why they bought the big cars, but it was the hotel and everything else.
Yep. I understood my parents as well. It was like the light bulb went off and I really understood why they would drive at night. They would always drive at night in the dark. You would drive it and people would, they'd get us up in the morning at 3 o'clock in the morning to start to go on vacation. And I thought, we're going on vacation. We should be relaxing. Why are we getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go on vacation? Well, you want to drive in the dark. It's more relaxing to drive in the dark because people can't see in the car. You're less likely to get stopped.
Yes. I still drive early.
I
know. One thing I forgot to do is ask our panelists if they have questions for one another, because it's been such a pleasure hearing all of you in discussion with one another. So I am wondering if one of you has something to ask one of the others.
I just want to say that I'm really excited to be on the panel with these two distinguished people because, you know, as a visual artist, you know, a lot of my inspiration comes from literature. A lot of my motivation for my art practice come from things that are not always visual, but they're about history. And it's about, you know, how can I, as an artist, communicate these histories in a way that's provocative enough for people to understand our full, the full spectrum of who we are as people without any, you know, without a need to apologize or to seek like an okay from anyone outside of who we are. And I look for, writings and literature that can really just confirm some of the things that I've known growing up as a person, and that when I'm thinking about what I want to see and what I want younger people to see, I want them to see stories like this, stories that talk about the Green Book in a certain way, stories that talk about paradise in a certain way, that, that will give us a sense of hope and a sense of normalcy for us to understand this kind of repetitive thing that happens around us that is oppressive. It's not that we are creating this repetitive loop. The oppressive structure around us is creating this loop. And so we need to know about these histories that are hidden for people to understand that we still have been able to prosper in some ways, regardless of all of these things that are snags in our way. And, and it's only going to make us stronger. Unfortunately, I mean, that's what I've understood from these circumstances. And I think that these conversations are going to be so much more empowering for people to understand where we are and what we represent as humans, as Black people in America and around in the world.
And they have to understand, even though you feel that I was illiterate, I was a slave, but I built the houses, the hotels, the motels, everything around was built on slave labor. If you look at all of the structures that are still standing, if you really researched back as far as who built that structure, it'll tell you who built it.
You mean the White House?
The person that didn't have the knowledge.
The Capitol of the United States, the White House of the United States. Yeah.
Yes.
Among others.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have a strong history, but the history is often covered up. And until we can come together and show that our history is important and it is a part of the American history, depending on where we are, we have so many cultures embedded within the African American structure, because it's not just Black. You have a lot of men that was called mulatto before they was called mixed, and you have a lot of Spanish people. I mean, it's just, there is no race, I say, that's the pure race, because we all mixed up with something.
Yeah, that's true.
Just saying what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, it's true.
So we have to acknowledge that we are a part of the history, and we come from different backgrounds, depending on what level you are. Everyone is important to what we do because they are a part of it. And we're standing on their foundations that they built. So we need to keep building them.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading Cynthia's book.
Me too.
I already have mine.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading yours.
I'm getting both.
So do we get a painting?
Now there's a good question. I feel like I've been following Derrick Adams around because I spoke on a panel about his work at the Museum of Art and Design. Did you know that, Derrick?
I read it. I knew you did, but I didn't meet you, but I knew you did. They wanted you there. They wanted you there. They wanted you there. I remember that.
Yeah, you weren't there, but I feel like I was following you around, and it was very exciting for me to meet you this evening. It's like, yay, finally.
I'm glad to meet you. I am. I'm really excited for this panel. It's such a great combination of speakers for this panel. I think it was like a perfect storm, you know.
Mm-hmm. So if you went Paradise Park, it's full of pictures because I'm a photographer. And when we took the book to put it together, we wanted to make sure that it was designed in a magazine type style, because I love pictures. And pictures, when we deal with some of our elders, they can't read it, but those pictures say 1,000 words.
Wow.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important. So we must keep history alive. And I have my little my little story collection that I've started. And it's just about individuals in our community that made a difference during the time that they were coming up. And this was during segregation. They thrived. Mr. James will be 100 years old, just a little book. He'll be 100 on January 1st.
Wow.
And he wanted his story written, and he had several people to interview him, but they never put it in a book. All he wanted was something in a book with his picture on it. How hard can that be? So we just make things happen.
Yeah.
So
But I am still looking for a painting.
Okay.
Be a little one. Postcard size.
There are still so many questions to get to, and I'm sorry we haven't gone into all of them, but I thought just to wrap up, we would take this question from Julie, which is, well, first of all, thanking all of you for your time tonight, but what are you working on next? What books, what art, what projects?
For me, it's the My Story series, which is short stories about individuals and communities that are often not recognized. So that's what I've started. I self-publish them, I lay them out, I design them myself.
Wow.
And I print them. So, well, I send them to a printer technically, but it's just so much history to be, it's not uncovered, but to know about. Like the Green Book is powerful. And I think all of us have used the Green Book. I talk about the Green Book in Paradise Park as well, because we had a hotel. There was no hotel accommodations. Even though we had thousands and thousands of people to visit Paradise Park, there were no hotel accommodations. So they had to use those cars that you're talking about to sleep in.
Wow.
So, I mean, thousands, and they had very prominent people like Dr. Bethune to come and visit Paradise Park. The one year she came, 1950, was 8,000 people there.
Wow.
Wow.
So it's a beautiful, beautiful place. You can't visit, but it's a beautiful place if they ever open up that section. So my goal with Paradise Park is to hopefully work with the state to open up that part of Silver Springs and just give it the title Paradise Park and leave the color part off.
Mm-hmm.
That's my goal for Paradise Park. I would
That's
like to see it open for some purpose with that title on it.
You can do it.
Oh yeah.
I think
That'd be
so.
great.
If you believe,
Yep.
all things are possible.
Yep.
Okay, I'm believing I'm gonna get my picture too.
Yeah. That's possible.
Laughing.
I'm working on with a photographer who is taking pictures. The state of New York acquired a series of suitcases that belonged to people who were in a mental institution called Willowbrook that closed because of the horrific conditions. And people were allowed to bring one suitcase when they came. And instead of letting the people have their suitcases, they put these suitcases up in the attic. And then when Willowbrook was closed, the suitcases went to the State Museum. And there's a photographer who's taking pictures of these suitcases with these are the only objects people could bring with them to the mental institution. And they never got them back.
Wow.
And he asked me if I'd write an essay about the conditions of mental institutions and the history of mental institutions. And I thought about it, and it's not only an African-American project, but, it's a project about forgotten people and people who have been treated badly by our society. So that's what I'm going to do next, is write that piece for this book about these forgotten people and their objects, the precious things that they took with them to the mental institution, and how those objects reflect their, who they were. And then they all died in that place.
Exactly, because that was their home.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, I'm in the middle of doing a lot of different things creatively, but I'm also in the midst of opening or creating a a creative residency, a retreat in Baltimore, where I'm from, called the Last Resort Artist Retreat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's basically a space for Black creatives in areas of visual arts, culinary, literary, sound, and dance to come for leisure. So the concept is not really about making anything. It's about social engagement. And it's also about, you know, it's a non-working residency and retreat. So it's gonna focus more on meditation and, you know, yoga, some lectures, some conversations around ideas to deal with food, mental health, creativity, things that I feel are lacking in the community. And it's hopefully it'll be a more international project, but I'm also excited about the opportunity of having, you know, various generations of Black creatives in this space throughout the year in a cycle of 4 at a time, coming into this space property I acquired in Baltimore in the middle of town. It's a pretty significant scale. It's really more about just about leisure, about the things that were always interrupted. We were always interrupted in. And I'm really trying to think about preserving this space just for that, you know, which is you know, it's going to be a challenge. Inviting artists to come to a place to do nothing, you know, or the idea that you're invited somewhere for a month to actually do nothing at all I think it will be a challenge for most people. But I think it's going to be great.
Not me.
I mean, I have a hard time of really relaxing, and I think that I've never seen a space like this. I've never experienced been a part of something like this. So I feel really excited about the opportunity. You know, there will be other guests, you know, other races, other cultural groups coming in to dialogue with the residents that are there. But the facilities the housing is focused on Black creatives and allies who believe that they need these people need time to heal and to withdraw from certain things and to replenish certain energies. I feel like it's important, and I want to be the facilitator of that. And so I you know, I have this property and I've been working on it, and I'm hoping the next year or so it'll be open and I'll be able to invite people to come and be a part of it.
You know, when you say that, it reminded me of the images that you showed of Martin Luther King in Jamaica, because whenever Martin Luther King was exhausted, and, you know, the work that he was doing was so incredibly taxing and frightening, and, you know, people were threatening him constantly. And when he was exhausted, he wanted to swim. And he often went to Florida because, you know, it was just, it was close by, and he would go to the Hampton House and he would swim. And when you showed us all the picture of him in Jamaica in the pool, it made me think of those experiences, how he really needed a place where he could go and rest. Because the civil rights movement, when you think about how taxing, how exhausting it was to constantly have that threat to your family.
Yeah.
So you are following in a tradition, you know, that is well established in the Black community. I think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I'll have to invite you to come. I'll have to invite you both.
Absolutely,
to come.
I love Paul.
Yeah, I would love.
Did you hear that we have this on recording?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Hilarious.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally.
Well, so many thanks to the three of you for being with us tonight, and to our audience, and for all the incredible work that you're doing. We can't overstate it enough, but thank you.
Thank you.
Please take care.
Thank you.
Really
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
All right, get that picture.
Yep, I'm rolling it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
Take
right.
care.
Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.